It is the 9th of April, 1945, somewhere on the flat, sodden farmland east of the Rhine, and a column of American Sherman tanks has stopped dead in a lane between two plowed fields. The engines idle. Nobody moves. Somewhere ahead, hidden under a skin of mud and old snow, is a belt of German mines, and nobody in the column knows exactly where it begins or where it ends. A young lieutenant leans out of his turret, scanning the tree line through binoculars that show him nothing useful at all, and then, so the story goes, a boy walks out of a farmhouse doorway, no older than 12 or 13, and simply starts walking down the lane in front of the leading tank, tracing a line only he seems to know. This is one of those stories that circulates in the margins of the Second World War, told and retold by veterans in reunion halls, printed in regimental newsletters, occasionally surfacing in a local history society's newsletter decades later. It is worth saying plainly, before going any further, that no official after-action report has ever been positively matched to this exact episode. No named unit history records a nameless German boy leading Patton's Third Army through a minefield on a specific date at a specific crossroads. What survives is testimony, secondhand and thirdhand, passed between men who were there in that general stretch of Germany in that general week, and it deserves to be treated as exactly that, a fragment of memory from the chaotic final weeks of the war, not a certified fact with a file number attached. But the fragment is worth examining closely, because whether or not this precise boy on this precise afternoon existed exactly as remembered, it captures something true about how the Third Army's advance through Germany actually happened in dozens of villages over and over in the spring of 1945. By early April 1945, George Patton's Third Army was moving east across Germany faster than almost any armored force in history had moved before it. Columns that had spent the previous autumn grinding meter by meter through the Lorraine mud were suddenly covering 30, 40, 50 kilometers a day. The German army in the west was not so much defeated as dissolved, its formations broken into pockets, its reserves gone, its fuel gone, its young men and old men and boys pressed into whatever uniform could be found. And this speed created a very specific, very dangerous problem. The engineers who would normally have swept a route ahead of the tanks, marking cleared lanes with white tape and probing the verges with mine detectors, simply could not keep pace. Reconnaissance that in 1944 might have taken 2 days now had to happen in 2 hours, or not at all. Maps were frequently wrong or simply absent for the smaller farm roads that crisscrossed the German countryside, roads that mattered enormously to a tank column looking for the fastest route to the next river crossing. Into this gap stepped the mine itself, and it deserves a moment's attention, because the German mines scattered across these approaches were not crude obstacles. The standard Teller mine, roughly 30 centimeters across and weighing around 9 kilograms, carried enough explosive to blow the track from a Sherman and often enough to kill the crew inside if it detonated beneath the hull rather than the tread. Retreating German units, often engineer detachments working with whatever stock remained in local depots, laid these mines in irregular patterns rather than the neat geometric belts of earlier years, because they no longer had the time or the men to do it properly. That irregularity made the mines, paradoxically, more dangerous to an advancing force. A minefield laid to a known pattern could be predicted and probed systematically. A minefield laid in haste by exhausted men working through the night with whatever remained in the crates followed no pattern at all, and a column that hit even one mine might lose an hour, a tank, or several men, at a moment when every hour mattered enormously to the wider collapse of the German front. There was no shortage of German civilians, meanwhile, who knew exactly where those mines had gone into the ground, because they had watched them being laid, or had been forced to help lay them, or had simply lived on the farm in question their entire lives and noticed the disturbed earth along the hedgerow that had not been there the week before. Farm boys in particular, the sons of families who worked the very fields being mined, often had an intimate, almost unconscious knowledge of their own land, down to which furrow had been recently turned and which patch of grass had been recently replaced. This is the setting in which stories like the one at the beginning of this account took root, not as an isolated miracle, but as one version of a pattern repeated, with variations in village after village as the Americans pushed east. A local person, sometimes an adult, sometimes a teenager, sometimes reportedly a child, stepping forward to guide an advancing column around a hazard that the column's own reconnaissance had no way of detecting in time. Why would a German civilian help an invading American force, particularly in the final desperate weeks when Nazi propaganda was still insisting on resistance to the last, and when deserters and collaborators faced brutal punishment from the retreating SS and from local fanatics organized into so-called werewolf cells? The honest answer is that motives varied enormously and are rarely recoverable in full. Some accounts suggest simple self-preservation. Families terrified that continued fighting around their farm would see their home destroyed or their livestock killed in crossfire, calculating that a swift, bloodless American passage through the village was infinitely preferable to a battle. Others point to plain exhaustion with the war itself, a sentiment increasingly common among ordinary Germans by the spring of 1945, after 6 years of losses, rationing, bombing, and the visible collapse of every promise the regime had made. Still others record more mercenary calculations, families hoping that cooperation might earn them better treatment, food, or simple safety once the fighting moved past. What all of these explanations share is an acknowledgement that by this stage of the war, the relationship between occupying force and occupied population in Western Germany was far more fluid and complicated than the propaganda on either side allowed for. The tanks themselves, it is worth pausing to describe, were extraordinary machines to encounter for any civilian, let alone a child who had likely spent years being told these vehicles belonged to a monstrous enemy. A Sherman M4 weighed around 30 tons, stood over 2.5 meters tall, and produced an engine note that witnesses across many accounts describe in strikingly similar terms. A deep, continuous growl audible from well over a kilometer away, closer to the sound of a goods train than anything on a farm. Diesel and petrol fumes hung around the column. The tracks alone, each link the size of a large book, chewed the road surface into ruts as the column advanced. For a boy who had perhaps never seen a vehicle larger than his father's cart, walking in front of one of these machines, deliberately, calmly, tracing a path with his own feet across ground he knew held buried explosives, would have required a peculiar, situational kind of courage, less the courage of a soldier trained for combat, and more the specific, practical bravery of someone who simply knows the ground better than anyone else present and decides that knowledge is worth more than fear. The operational record of these small, unofficial acts of local guidance is, by its nature, thin. Official Third Army records concentrate overwhelmingly on unit movements, casualties, objectives taken, fuel consumed, tonnage of bridging equipment used at river crossings. They were never designed to capture the 15 minutes in which a nameless local resident walked a company commander around a hazard and then disappeared back into a farmhouse before anyone thought to record a name. What does survive? Scattered across veterans' memoirs, oral history collections gathered decades later by local museums, and the kind of story passed down through American families whose grandfathers served in the Third Army that spring is a consistent pattern rather than a single confirmed incident. Reports of children, of old men, of women, stepping into the path of an advancing column in the last weeks of the war in Germany, offering guidance through mined ground, and vanishing from the historical record almost as quickly as they appear in it. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing. It is worth setting this pattern against the roughly comparable and rather better documented episode of the German boy discovered guarding an American prisoner of war camp near Hammelburg that same April, a 14-year-old pressed into service by an army that had run entirely out of adult men to spare, a detail that illustrates just how thoroughly German manpower had collapsed by this point in the war, to the extent that children were being used for duties that had nothing to do with local knowledge or goodwill and everything to do with simple desperation. It is also worth setting it against the documented episode from Patton's own ill-fated task force bomb, sent that same March to try to liberate a prisoner of war camp holding, among others, Patton's own son-in-law, in which the American column, having lost its bearings after a bridge was destroyed beneath them, obtained the assistance of a German civilian to help redirect their route. That incident is properly recorded, if only briefly, in post-war accounts of the raid, and it demonstrates that the underlying phenomenon, ordinary Germans providing practical assistance to American forces in the war's final weeks, was real and repeated, even if any single dramatic version of it, involving a specific child and a specific minefield, resists precise verification. There is no equivalent story on the German side to compare this against in the usual sense, because the entire premise runs against the direction of the war by April 1945. There was no advancing German force in the West left to be guided anywhere. The more useful comparison is with how other Allied armies handled the same problem of unmapped hazards and unreliable local intelligence during their own advances into Germany that spring. British and Canadian forces pushing into the north of the country relied more heavily on formal engineering reconnaissance and captured German mine-laying records where these could be recovered, a slower but more systematic approach that reflected, in part, the different terrain and pace of the northern advance. Soviet forces coming from the east operated under an entirely different calculation, treating German civilian assistance with far greater suspicion, and in many documented instances, simply accepting higher casualties from mines and booby traps as the cost of maintaining the pace of the advance, rather than pausing to build the kind of ad hoc, informal cooperation with local residents that appears to have characterized parts of the American advance in the West. None of this proves the specific opening story true in every detail, but it does show that Patton's Third Army was operating in a context where local, informal, sometimes childlike sources of help were both plausible and, according to the surviving testimony, not unusual. What can be said with real confidence is this: the psychological impact of these encounters, whatever their exact number and detail, rippled outward well beyond the tactical value of a single cleared lane through a single minefield. For American soldiers who had spent months fighting an enemy defined almost entirely by uniform and ideology, an encounter with an ordinary German child offering practical help complicated the picture in ways many veterans later described as unsettling and, eventually, humanizing. For the German civilians involved, the choice to step forward, whatever mixture of fear, exhaustion, and calculation lay behind it, represented one of the first small acts of a population beginning to imagine a life after Nazism, before that life had properly begun, while the war around them was still being fought street by street and field by field. It is this human dimension, more than any precise casualty figure or a mine's exact weight of explosive, that keeps stories of this kind circulating among veterans and their descendants long after the official records have gone quiet. The legacy of these small, largely unrecorded episodes lies not in any museum plaque or preserved vehicle, though plenty of Sherman tanks of the type that rolled through German villages that spring do survive today in collections such as the Tank Museum in Bovington and various American armor collections, where visitors can stand beside one and get some sense of the sheer scale a child would have faced walking in front of it. The real legacy lies instead in what these stories tell us about the final weeks of the war in the West, a period far messier and far more morally ambiguous than the clean narrative of liberation and surrender that followed it. Advancing armies did not simply defeat a uniformed enemy and then encounter a grateful populace. They moved through a landscape of exhausted, frightened, calculating human beings, adults and children alike, each making their own small decisions about survival, cooperation, and risk, decisions that rarely made it into any official report, but that shaped, in dozens of quiet, unglamorous moments, exactly how fast and how safely the Allied advance actually moved. So we return to that lane east of the Rhine, the tanks idling, the boy walking ahead with a certainty that no American officer could have manufactured out of a map or a radio call. Whether this precise scene happened exactly as told, on this exact date, in this exact place, cannot be proven from the surviving record, and honesty demands that be said plainly rather than glossed over for the sake of a tidier ending. What can be said is that scenes very much like it happened repeatedly across the German countryside in the spring of 1945, as ordinary people, some of them barely more than children, stepped into the gap left by a collapsing army and a racing invasion, and chose, for reasons we can only partly reconstruct, to help rather than hide. A war fought by great armies and vast strategies was, in these final weeks, also decided in these tiny, unrecorded acts. One careful footstep at a time, one boy, one lane,